Welcome back. Well, after weeks of no comments, angry denials, and even running through hotel kitchens, Senator Mike Duffy suddenly reversed himself last week and said he'll now pay back the living allowance that he claimed for his home in Ottawa. He still hasn't exactly admitted any wrongdoing, but instead says that the rules need to be made more clear. Joining me to talk about this now is Rob Russo, the bureau chief for Canadian Press here in Ottawa, and Paul Wells of Maclean's Magazine. Welcome to you both. So, Senator Duffy says he's going to pay back the money. Nothing to see here, folks. Move along. Is this story over, Rob?
I don't think so. I think the reason why Senator Duffy hurried before the cameras on a Friday afternoon in the latest sort of news dump of the government was because he could hear the thump of the auditor's briefcase about to drop in front of him, which is going to come out with a report probably showing that he probably made some mistakes. And he won't be the only senator involved in having made mistakes. If you look really closely in the clips of Senator Duffy, though, if you look at his back, you can see the hand of Nigel Wright between his shoulders, sort of moving his mouth.
He's the chief of staff to the Prime Minister.
That's right.
Yeah.
This is not an admission, from what I'm told, that was made willingly. And there does seem to be a lack of contrition in it as well, when he basically says, I don't have to do this, but I'm doing it anyway. And I never understand why politicians just can't go in front of a camera and say, look, you know what? I was wrong. I made a mistake. I'm sorry. I'm going to rectify it. Because I think the Canadians actually would give people a second chance if they did that.
You know, Paul, it's interesting because the Prime Minister's press secretary said he knew absolutely nothing about Duffy on Friday. He said he had no idea that he was going to go on CBC and make this admission. So how much of this is being controlled by the Prime Minister's office? And does it really put an end to this, or just does it open up more questions?
Well, I suspect some of it. I suspect it may be controlled out of Marjorie Le Breton's office, the Senate leader for the government, and she's got enough autonomy that she could by herself tell Mike Duffy it's time to fess up. And I mean, Duffy has a certain level of autonomy of his own. I mean, it sure wasn't the Prime Minister's office that told him to come up with this cockamamie idea of gluing the 4 Atlantic provinces together into one big one. That was Mike all by himself.
You know, he says, look, the forms are very confusing, and that it was an accounting mistake that he made. I just want to show everybody the forms that he's talking about, and I'm sort of not sure how confusing this really is. There's 2 boxes on this form. You can see it there. One box says my residence is within 100 kilometers from Parliament Hill. The other one says it's more than 100 kilometers from Parliament Hill, and furthermore, secondary residence in the National Capital Region, only to be filled out by senators who say their primary residence is more than 100 kilometers away from Parliament Hill. I'm not seeing how that's a really complicated thing. I mean, most people know where they live.
Oh, another weary traveler confused by the distinction between Cavendish and Canada, I suppose, is what's going on. Look, again, it would have been very easy for him to just say, look, I made a mistake. And this is going to make the story go on and on and on. This is not going to put it away, those kinds of explanations. He also says that he has a lot of currency in the public opinion bank. Boy, it would be interesting to see how much he's drawn down on that currency over the last few weeks. I actually think that he might be running an overdraft right now.
Well, it is interesting because all those who say that when they got appointed to the Senate, they supported the idea of an elected Senate. I'm not sure a whole lot of them could get elected now if they went there. Paul, I want to come to you on a sort of a broader topic of the Senate, but I want to introduce it by showing you a clip from Senator Hugh Segal, I think one of the brightest political minds on Parliament Hill, incidentally. Here's the argument. People say, look, the Senate is maybe flawed, but it's filled with people who do terrific work, and that we shouldn't overlook that. I put that argument to Hugh Segal. Here's what he said. Take a listen.
People say Senate does great work, committees do great work, and I've had a privilege to work with other senators on important projects. My response to that is there were really sharp economists working in the Kremlin all those years doing great work on 5-year plans. They were really outstanding. Bottom line is it was a totalitarian state. They had no democratic legitimacy. The Senate of Canada is in the same circumstance.
Goes Hugh Segal saying that there's sort of an equivalency between the Kremlin of old and the Senate of today, but his point is that there is no legitimacy. He's pushing the idea of a national referendum, an up or down on the Senate. Does that make any sense to you, Paul?
Yeah, but it'd have to be an up, down, or sideways, right? I mean, incidentally, Hugh Segal has a good line, but he still cashes the check, right? I mean, it's worth noting. Secondly, if you don't like the Senate we got, What do you do next is a non-trivial question. There was a poll that came out last week that was almost cruel. It said more than 70% of people want the Senate to be abolished or reformed. That's like saying more than 70% of people want Downton Abbey to be canceled or renewed. They're opposite answers. If you don't want the Senate ever to sit again, and you want it to take a new renewed role in the center of our national life, I don't get to add your opinions up.
Okay, but then what are you saying? Is there we at gridlock on this? There's nothing you can do?
There's a million prime ministers have found that there is no consensus on what to do with the Senate. Stephen Harper has spent several years trying something interesting, which is essentially to peck at it and see what happens. Let's try appointing senators on the understanding that they'll leave after a relatively short amount of time. That hasn't yet been tested. It'll be interesting to see what happens when it is. When senators like Siegel are asked, do you feel like leaving now even though the law doesn't require you to? And then the Supreme Court reference, which is this incredible smorgasbord of options of possible reform or abolition. And then the Supreme Court might give Harper a restricted list of things that it's possible to do from which you can go forward. But it's like when Australia had that referendum on abolishing the monarchy and becoming a republic several years ago. There were way more people who were interested in abolishing the monarchy than there were interested in the specific option of republic that was put to them. That's almost always going to be the case.
In a very short period of time that we got left, I want to jump away from the Senate. I can't believe we're spending all this time talking about the Senate. But a big story coming up in the next week or two is going to be the free trade deal between Canada and the European Union. The European trade representative saying last week that Canada's just not putting enough on the table to make this deal happen. Rob, from what you know, are we in danger of losing this free trade deal with Europe?
I don't think so. I think the Europeans are probably better negotiators than we are. They're certainly acting tougher. Minister Ed Fast is over there this coming week to try and get these things back on the rails, if they're off the rails. I'm told they're not. The interesting thing about the talks, from our perspective, is everybody thought the provinces were going to be a problem here in Canada. They've actually fallen in the line quite well, from what I understand. But the 27 members of the EU have not, and they're being powered by Germany, which is raising all kinds of obstacles to the deal. And I think it's just tough negotiations and good negotiations from the EU part.
I've only got 30 seconds left, but Paul?
In 1988, the beginning of 1988, Simon Reisman, the Canadian negotiator on Canada-U.S. free trade, made a great show of stomping out because the Americans weren't stepping up to the plate. And then we had a deal. That may well be what's happening here. On the small chance that there is no deal, there are reasons why not. Because the European Union is fundamentally protectionist. Canada is fundamentally protectionist. It's not natural for us to trade freely. And political leaders there, or Stephen Harper here, may simply say, it's not worth it. Remember, the second place candidate for the Progressive Conservative leadership in 2003 was David Orchard. There is a strong protectionist nationalist strain in Canadian politics. And Stephen Harper is pragmatic enough to say, that's kind of interesting.
Paul Wells of Maclean's Magazine. Rob Russo, Bureau Chief of Canadian Press. Thanks very much for being here. Good conversation. Well, you can catch the whole interview with Senator Hugh Siegel, by the way, on our website, thewestblock.ca. And coming up next on the show, sequestration, a strange name for a very strange but very real crisis. But what will actually happen on the March 1st deadline? And what does it all mean for Canadians? That's next.